The sun hung low over the red hills of the Arizona frontier, its dying light casting long shadows across the dust-choked road that wound between the canyons. The air was dry and still, heavy with the scent of mesquite and smoke from faraway campfires. On that road came a small Apache procession, moving in silence, their faces carved with the solemn weight of old law. In the middle of them, a young woman walked barefoot, her wrists bound loosely with rawhide, her eyes lowered but burning with the quiet fire of pride. She did not cry. She did not plead. She only walked, steady, graceful, her hair wild and uncombed, the sun touching it like strands of black fire. Behind her, 2 elders rode on weary ponies. One of them, his face hard as dried leather, spoke low to the other. "She broke the vow," he said. "She must pay." The other elder nodded, though his eyes carried something close to pity. "Better a life of shame than none at all," he murmured. The woman heard them, but she kept walking. Her name had already been stripped from her tongue. Her tribe had declared her unworthy of it. She was no longer daughter, no longer warrior. She was to be given away to a white farmer, one of the poorest in the valley, as punishment for her defiance. Down in the wide valley below, the land stretched dry and cracked. A few small shacks stood scattered near the creek, where the wind carried the smell of sweat and cornmeal. Life here was hard and simple, the kind that shaped quiet people and broke loud ones. The man they called the poor farmer lived alone on the far edge of this valley, in a cabin made of split logs and patched roof tin. His fields were narrow and half dead from drought, his barn crooked and small. Yet he worked it every day, steady as the sun, because he had nothing else left to work for. He was not old, though his face had the worn look of a man who had forgotten how to dream. Folks said his wife had died in the spring flood 3 years ago, carried down the creek with the rising water while he watched helplessly from the bank. Since then, he had stopped talking to anyone who didn't bring seed or salt. His life was the land, and the land gave him nothing but struggle. That evening, as he was mending a fence post, he saw the dust trail rising from the hills and knew the Apache were coming. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers, and waited. When they reached his yard, the elder dismounted and spoke in halting English. "This woman is punishment," he said. "For her shame, she must live in your house. Feed her, make her work. She is yours now." The farmer frowned, glancing at the woman who stood behind them. Her head bowed, but her shoulders squared like someone facing a storm. He didn't answer at first. The elder repeated the words and tossed a small bundle of her belongings, only a blanket and a clay charm, onto the ground. Then, without another word, the riders turned and left, their figures swallowed by the fading light. The farmer stood for a long time, the silence between them thick as the heat. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You can stay in the shed," he said. "Work starts at dawn." She said nothing, only lifted her chin a little, as though she had already decided she would not be broken by him or anyone else. That night, the wind howled through the gaps in the boards, carrying the cries of coyotes from the desert edge. The woman sat on the dirt floor of the shed, her eyes tracing the cracks of moonlight that slipped through the walls. She touched the clay charm, the last piece of her past, and whispered words in her language. Words that might have been prayer or promise. Out in the house, the farmer lay awake too, listening to the wind and wondering what kind of justice had been done that day. He did not ask for her, yet here she was, another mouth to feed, another shadow in a house already haunted by silence. Days passed slow and hot. She rose before sunrise, fetching water, chopping wood, tending the sickly corn. She did not speak, but her movements were sure, practiced, strong. The farmer watched her from a distance, unsure whether to feel grateful or resentful. The neighbors whispered that he had taken an Apache woman for himself, that it was a curse or a gift depending on who you asked. Some said she'd bring bad luck. Others said maybe she'd breathe life back into the place. But none dared come too close. The girl, though cast out, carried the spirit of the land with her, the wild heart of the desert that refused to bow to anyone. Slowly, something changed in the air around the cabin. The hens began laying again. The creek ran a little clearer. Even the old mule seemed to walk steadier. The farmer noticed it but said nothing. He still kept his distance, still spoke little. But in the quiet moments he found himself watching her hands as she worked, the calm rhythm of her breath as she moved through the day. There was a peace in her silence that the desert itself seemed to echo, but deep beneath that peace lived a storm neither of them could name. At night, when the moon was high, she sometimes stood outside looking toward the dark ridges where her people lived. There was longing in her eyes, but not regret. Something else, something fierce and unyielding. And though she had been cast out, the desert wind still carried whispers of her tribe. Whispers that one day they might come for her. The farmer, too, began to feel the stir of unease. He had taken no part in her punishment, but he knew what men whispered in town. That an Apache woman under a white man's roof was a spark waiting for fire. The land was still raw with fear and pride, and both burned quick when rubbed together. One morning he found a token left at the edge of his field, a circle of black feathers tied with red string. He knew enough of their meaning to understand. It was a warning. The tribe was watching. That night he told her quietly, "They'll come for you." She looked at him, her eyes steady as ever, and said, "Then let them come." He didn't sleep after that. The next day he worked the field harder than usual, the sun beating down as sweat stung his eyes. She brought him water, and for the first time he saw a trace of softness in her face, a wordless thank you that passed between them like the brief touch of a breeze. Something unspoken had begun to grow in that barren land, something fragile and alive. But the shadow of vengeance was already moving closer. From the distant hills came riders in the dusk, their figures small but certain, the drums of hooves echoing faintly across the dry plain. The farmer looked toward the horizon, his heart tightening. The woman stood beside him, her expression unreadable but her hands clenched at her sides. The sky was turning red again, just as it had the day she was brought here. And as the wind rose, carrying the faint sound of war cries through the canyon, the farmer understood. Whatever had begun between them, whatever strange bond had taken root in that lonely valley, was about to be tested in ways neither of them could escape. The story of the poor farmer and the Apache woman was only beginning, and the desert had not yet decided whether it would bury them or let them bloom. The next morning came heavy with dust and silence. The farmer woke before dawn as usual, though he had barely slept. The echoes of the distant hooves still played in his mind, blending with the memory of her standing beside him in the dim red light. The world outside was still gray when he pushed open the cabin door. The woman was already awake, sitting by the fire pit, grinding corn with slow, steady motions. She looked up briefly, her dark eyes calm, as if the night before hadn't happened at all. He studied her for a moment, then turned toward the barn without a word. The air was dry, thick with the scent of sagebrush. He led his mule to the field, where the corn struggled for life in thin lines of pale green. The land had always fought him, and sometimes he wondered if it wanted him gone. Every crop, every patch of soil felt like a battle. But that day his thoughts weren't on the field, they were on her tribe. He'd heard the stories told around the saloon in town, about Apache revenge, about fires that appeared on lonely farms after a warning went unheeded. He'd always thought those were just tales to scare travelers, but now he wasn't sure. By midday the heat had turned merciless. When he came back toward the house, he found her hanging fresh herbs along the porch rail. They filled the air with a wild, clean smell that somehow cut through the dust. "You shouldn't be outside alone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She didn't answer, only tied another bundle. He frowned. "You heard me?" he asked. She looked at him then, and there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "I hear everything," she said softly, her accent giving the words a strange musical edge. Then she turned back to her work, leaving him standing there uncertain. He went inside and poured a cup of water, watching her through the window. For a woman punished by her own people, she showed no sign of fear. If anything, she seemed more alive than before. She worked without complaint, moved with purpose, and carried herself like someone who knew she belonged to the earth, even if no one else claimed her. Sometimes at night he caught her humming low songs by the fire, songs that spoke of something older than any town or fence line. A few days passed like that, quiet but tense. The farmer noticed the small changes she made around the place. She mended the roof with woven reeds, sealed the cracks in the cabin walls, and cleaned the tools that had long been rusted. The mule stopped limping, the hens grew fatter, and somehow even the crops seemed to hold more color. He couldn't explain it. It felt as if the land itself recognized her touch. Yet the more the farm began to breathe again, the heavier the air felt between them. He tried not to watch her, but it was impossible. There was something about her silence that spoke louder than words. It wasn't submission, no, it was something else. A quiet strength, a mystery he couldn't reach, and though he told himself she was just another mouth to feed, he began to find reasons to linger near where she worked. When she went to the creek to wash clothes, he found himself fixing the fence nearby. When she gathered herbs at dusk, he'd carry wood just a few steps behind. Neither spoke of it, but both knew. Still, the warning in his field haunted him. He'd buried the circle of feathers behind the barn, but some nights when the wind moaned across the hills, he swore he could hear the faint sound of riders again. Distant, patient, waiting. The townsfolk had started to whisper too. He'd seen the looks at the trading post, the stares, the murmurs. One man spat near his boots and said, "You best keep her where she belongs, or her kind will burn you out." The farmer said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He loaded his supplies, turned his wagon around, and didn't look back. When he reached home, she was waiting by the porch, her hair loose and glinting in the sun. He handed her the flour sack and she nodded without a word. But that night, as they ate in silence, he finally spoke what had been burning in his mind. "Your people," he said quietly. "They sent a warning." Her hands froze on the wooden bowl. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. "They do not forgive easily," she said at last. "They think I forgot who I am. They think shame will make me crawl back." He leaned forward, his voice low. "And will it?" She lifted her gaze to his, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of something that wasn't pride or anger. It was sorrow. "No," she said. "Because I have nowhere to crawl back to." The words hung heavy between them. He didn't press her. Outside, a coyote called, and the wind sighed through the mesquite trees. She turned away from the fire, her face half in shadow. "They will come," she whispered. "Maybe not today, maybe not soon, but they will." The following days brought strange signs. The chickens refused to roost one night, clucking in panic though nothing stirred nearby. The mule broke its tether and ran until dawn. One morning the farmer found tracks in the dust, barefoot, small, and circling the house. He followed them out to the edge of the field, but they vanished near the creek. He said nothing to her, though he saw her glance toward the hills more often. One evening, she came back from the creek carrying something wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table and opened it, a small carved figure made of wood shaped like a bird. "I found it in the water," she said. He looked closer. The carving was old, the edges worn smooth. "It's a message," she added quietly. "It means they have found me." He stared at her, unsure what to say. "What do they want?" he asked. Her answer came in a whisper. "Justice or blood. Sometimes it is the same." That night the wind rose again, tearing through the valley with a hollow roar. The sky filled with shifting clouds that glowed faintly under the moon. The farmer sat awake listening to the shutters creak, the roof groan. Somewhere outside, the horses cried out. When he stepped onto the porch, he saw her standing at the edge of the yard, her hair whipping in the wind. She didn't turn when he called her name. She just stood there staring toward the black horizon. "What are you looking for?" he asked, his voice barely carrying above the wind. "Smoke," she said. "The kind that means they are near." He followed her gaze but saw only darkness. "If they come," he said slowly, "I won't let them take you." She turned then, and in her eyes was a storm older than the land itself. "You cannot stop what belongs to them," she said, "and I am both theirs and not theirs anymore." After that night, something changed between them. She spoke a little more, teaching him words from her tongue, explaining the herbs she gathered, the signs she read in the wind, and he listened, though he didn't always understand. He found himself drawn to her quiet wisdom, her way of seeing life not as ownership or loss but as balance. Still, beneath it all, the threat lingered like thunder on a far horizon. When the first smoke finally appeared, thin and curling beyond the ridge, she was the one who saw it first. She stood by the field, her body still, her eyes steady. "They're here," she said softly. The farmer came beside her, gripping the hoe handle in his hand like a weapon. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in deep red and gold. "How many?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "Enough," she said. "Enough to remind me who I was supposed to be." He swallowed hard, looking toward the hills. "Then maybe it's time they see who you are now." She turned to him, the faintest trace of a sad smile on her lips. "And who is that?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Someone who saved this place, someone who made it alive again." The words hung there as the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke closer. She looked toward the horizon once more, and in her eyes there was both fear and fire. The desert was holding its breath, and the air itself felt ready to break. Somewhere out there, hidden by the rising dusk, her tribe was moving closer, each step echoing the laws of blood and pride. The poor farmer and the woman once cast out now stood side by side on the land, that had become both curse and home. And as the first stars began to pierce the red sky, the earth seemed to whisper of the storm that was about to descend, one that would test not just their courage, but the fragile bond that had begun to root in the dust of that lonely valley. The days that followed were tense and strange, as if the whole valley was holding its breath. The farmer worked longer hours, his eyes always flicking toward the hills where faint trails of smoke sometimes appeared and vanished again. The Apache woman moved through her chores like she always had, quiet, precise, calm. But there was a new alertness in her eyes. She could feel her people near, their presence like a shadow stretching across her soul. The nights were worse. Coyotes cried longer, owls flew lower, and sometimes, from the dark edge of the field, came sounds that did not belong to the wind. One night, when the moon was thin as a blade, she woke to the sound of hoofbeats. They were faint, distant, but real. She rose and went outside, her bare feet silent on the dry earth. The farmer was already there, rifle in hand, staring into the dark. "They're watching," he said softly. She nodded. "They will not strike yet," she replied. "They are waiting to see if I still carry their shame." He looked at her, the moonlight outlining her face. "You don't owe them anything," he said. "They cast you out." She looked toward the hills, her voice quiet but steady. "You don't understand. When the tribe calls you back with anger, it is not to forgive. It is to remind the desert who it belongs to." The next morning brought a rare visitor. A rider from town, a trader who sometimes brought flour or tools, rode up the trail. He dismounted with a cautious look, his eyes darting between them. "You've got trouble coming," he said. "Some men in town been talking about you keeping an Apache woman here. They say it ain't right. Some are planning to come out this way." The farmer's jaw tightened. "Who?" The man shrugged uneasily. "A few ranch hands, a deputy maybe. They talk about laws, but you know how it goes. Folks get scared and fear turns to fire." He looked at the woman and shifted his hat. "No offense meant," he muttered. She didn't answer, only turned back toward the house, her face unreadable. After the trader left, the farmer stood in silence, gripping the porch railing. "Now we've got trouble on both sides," he said quietly. "Your people from the hills and mine from the town." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Both think they own the land." "Both wrong," she said simply. That night, the wind carried a strange sound through the valley, a chant, distant but rising and falling like the rhythm of the earth itself. The woman froze when she heard it. "It's them," she whispered. "They are calling me home. If I don't answer, they will come for both of us." The farmer lowered his rifle, uncertainty flashing across his face. "Then what do we do?" She looked toward the dark horizon where the hills loomed like sleeping beasts. "We wait. They will show their face soon enough." The following day, the tension seemed to thicken the air. The woman gathered herbs from the creek while the farmer mended a wagon wheel near the barn. When she returned, she found a feather laid across the doorstep, painted red at the tip. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. "They mean to test you," she said to herself, "to see if you still fear them." That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, two figures appeared near the far edge of the field. The farmer saw them first. Young Apache men on horseback sitting still as stones. They didn't move or speak. They just watched. The woman stood beside him, her voice low. "They are scouts. They won't attack. They just come to see if I still wear their shame." He wanted to chase them off, but she laid a hand on his arm. "Don't," she said softly. "If you show anger, they will return with fury." The riders stayed until dusk, then turned and disappeared into the canyon. The woman stood there long after, her face set and calm, though her heart beat like a drum. Inside, the farmer lit the lamp and sat at the table staring at the flame. "You could leave," he said suddenly. "Go north, find another settlement. I'd help you." She looked at him, the flicker of the lamp catching the glint in her eyes. "And if I leave," she said quietly, "they will follow me there. They don't want my body. They want my soul to kneel." The next morning the wind shifted. It came from the south now, hot and heavy, bringing with it the scent of sage and smoke. The woman felt it before he did. "The desert changes when blood is near," she murmured. The farmer frowned. "Blood?" She didn't answer, just turned toward the hills. By midday, the first riders from town appeared. There were 4 of them, rough men, faces red from sun and whiskey. One carried a badge that barely caught the light. They reined in their horses near the fence line. "You the man keeping that squaw?" One of them called out. The farmer stepped forward, his voice steady. She works here. That's all, the man spat into the dust. Ain't what folks say. Word is you're hiding her from her own kind. That makes you a fool, or a liar. The woman came to the doorway then, her presence sharp and still. The men stared, their expressions twisting with something between curiosity and contempt. Look at that, one muttered. Tame enough to keep house. The farmer's hand clenched, but he kept his voice calm. You've said your piece. Now ride on, the deputy dismounted, brushing dust from his coat. You don't understand how things work around here, he said slowly. When trouble brews, it spreads. You keep her here, you'll bring the tribe down on us all. Best you send her away. I told you, the farmer said, his voice low. She stays. The deputy stared at him a long moment, then swung back into his saddle. Don't say I didn't warn you, he said, turning his horse toward town. The others followed, but not before one spat again, this time toward the porch. The woman's gaze followed them until they vanished in the dust. Then she turned to the farmer. They will not forget this, she said softly. Nor will mine. That night was restless. The sky hung low, thick with heat. The farmer sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his knees, the smell of smoke still clinging to the air. The woman sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap. Why did they send you to me? He asked after a long silence. What crime could make your people cast you out? She didn't look at him when she answered. I defied the elder's order. They wanted me to marry a warrior who had blood on his hands. He had burned a settler's wagon, killed the family inside. I told them the spirits would not forgive. They said I spoke like a white woman. She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. So they made me a lesson. The farmer sat quietly, the weight of her words settling between them. And now they want to finish it, he said. She nodded once. Until they see me broken or gone. Later, when the fire burned low, he heard her speaking softly to the darkness. The words were not English, but he understood their meaning. They were not prayers for safety. They were calls for strength. Outside, the night seemed to listen. By the next morning, the first real signs of war appeared. Smoke rose from the far ridge, not a campfire, but a signal. The woman saw it and closed her eyes. It begins, she whispered. The farmer followed her gaze, the unease in his chest turning to dread. Then we hold fast, he said. This land's all I've got. She looked at him, her expression steady. And it's all I have left. For 3 days they prepared without speaking much. He gathered tools, checked ammunition, and reinforced the doors. She stored water and food, her movements deliberate and calm. At night they slept little, the sound of drums rolling faintly through the canyons like the heartbeat of the desert. On the 4th day, she went down to the creek and didn't return for a long while. When she finally came back, she carried something in her hand, a small bundle of roots and ash wrapped in cloth. It's for protection, she said, hanging it over the door. Not from bullets, from fear. He didn't ask questions. That evening, as the sun fell behind the red hills, both of them stood on the porch, watching the horizon. In the distance, dark figures moved along the ridge, slow and steady like shadows made flesh. The woman's voice was low but firm. They come at dusk. Always at dusk. The farmer's grip tightened on his rifle. Then we'll meet them when they do. The wind carried the faint sound of drums again, deeper now, closer. The earth seemed to tremble with each beat. She looked at him, her face half lit by the last light of day. They will not just test us, she said. They will try to take everything that binds us to this place. He met her gaze, and in that moment there was no fear, only a strange understanding. The poor farmer and the punished woman stood together, bound by fate and by the land itself, as the valley grew darker around them, and somewhere out beyond the rising wind, the riders were coming, neither side yet knowing how much would be lost before the desert decided who would stay and who would vanish into its endless silence. The desert turned strange that week, as if the land itself knew something was about to break. The wind stopped blowing, and the air hung still, thick with dust that refused to settle. The nights were darker than usual, the stars dim behind thin clouds. Even the animals kept silent. The farmer could feel the weight of it every time he stepped outside, the silence pressing against him like the pause before a storm. He worked in the field just to keep his hands busy, though his eyes always drifted to the ridges, searching for movement. The Apache woman kept to her tasks as if nothing had changed, though he could see it in her too, the alertness, the way her gaze lingered on the horizon, the way she sometimes froze as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Her senses were sharper than his. She felt things before they happened, and that frightened him more than anything else. One evening, while he was chopping wood near the barn, she appeared beside him. "They're close," she said quietly. He stopped mid-swing. "How close?" She pointed toward the far end of the field. "They've been watching us for days. Tonight they will test our strength." Her calm tone sent a chill through him. "You mean they'll attack?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet. They'll try to frighten us first. They want to see if I will run." He nodded slowly, gripping the axe handle tighter. The sun dipped low, painting the land in blood-colored light. The air smelled faintly of smoke again. She turned to him, her face unreadable. "When they come, don't fight first. Wait. They'll want to see who you are." As the last light faded, the first sound came. Soft hoofbeats carried on the wind. The farmer stepped onto the porch with his rifle. Across the field, he saw them. 3 riders, their horses moving in a slow circle, keeping just beyond the reach of the lamplight. They didn't speak, didn't draw weapons, just watched. The woman stood beside him, her head high. "Those are scouts," she whispered. "They watch for fear." He stood motionless, his heart thudding in his chest. The riders stayed for what felt like hours, their silhouettes shifting in the moonlight. Then as silently as they'd come, they turned and rode away, disappearing into the dark. The farmer let out the breath he'd been holding, but the woman's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "This was only the beginning," she said. "They will return when the wind changes." For days after, the wind didn't move at all. The stillness felt unnatural, like the desert had stopped breathing. The farmer barely slept, always half awake, always listening. At night, he sometimes heard faint whispers from the hills, a sound that could have been wind or voices carried from far away. The woman would sit by the fire, silent and thoughtful, her fingers tracing strange patterns in the dust. Then, one morning, they found the barn door open. The mule was gone. The farmer tracked the prints into the scrub brush and found them ending near a pile of rocks, tracks that vanished into nothing. When he came back, she was standing by the fence looking toward the hills. "They took it," she said softly. "To remind you they can." That night the town's trouble reached them again. A small group of men rode out from the settlement, their lanterns swinging like fireflies in the distance. The farmer saw them long before they arrived and told her to stay inside. When they reached the yard, the deputy called out, "You've got to listen this time. The sheriff says you bring her to town tomorrow. We'll send her east, away from here. She stays here," the farmer said firmly. The deputy sighed, shifting in the saddle. "You're not hearing me. The ranchers are scared. They think her tribe's coming to burn this whole valley. If you don't send her away, you'll bring it down on all of us." The farmer didn't back down. "If they come, it won't matter where she is. The land's already chosen its fight." The men exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered something under his breath, then spat in the dirt. "Suit yourself," the deputy said finally. "But when the smoke rises, don't expect any of us to ride out here." They turned and left, their lanterns fading into the night. The farmer stood there a long while, watching until the dark swallowed them. When he finally went inside, she was sitting by the fire, her eyes following him. "You chose your side," she said quietly. He sat down across from her. There was never another. The wind returned that night, low and restless, carrying the scent of ash and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat echoed faintly. The sound made the hair on his arms stand up. "It's time," she said. By dawn, the horizon was painted with smoke. It wasn't a large fire, yet, but it was close. The farmer went to the barn and checked what little ammunition he had left. She joined him there, her movement slow and steady. "They will come at night," she said. "They always move with the darkness." He looked at her then, really looked, at the calm in her eyes, the quiet strength in her face. "You could still go," he said softly. "They might take you back?" She smiled faintly, but it wasn't joy. "I have no place there anymore. They gave me to you to break me, but this place, this struggle, it made me whole again. If they come, I will not hide." The day passed like a waiting breath. The sun rose and fell. The shadows grew long and the world turned red again as the sky bled into evening. The smoke was closer now, drifting low through the valley. The birds had vanished. Even the creek seemed to run quieter. When night fell, the air turned cold and sharp. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound inside the small cabin. The farmer checked his rifle again, though he already knew it wouldn't be enough. She stood near the window looking out at the dark. "They're here," she whispered. He followed her gaze. Shapes moved between the trees, silent, slow, patient. The air carried a strange rhythm, like the heartbeat of the land itself. He stepped to the door, his breath steady, his mind clear. The woman touched his arm. "Wait," she said. "Let them see us first." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the cold wind hitting his face. In the faint light of the lantern, he could see them now. Dozens of riders, their shadows long against the ground. One broke away from the rest and came forward, his horse's hooves striking the earth like thunder. The rider stopped just beyond the gate, his face painted in black and red. He spoke in Apache, his voice deep and sharp. The woman stepped forward, her chin high, and answered in the same tongue. The exchange was fierce but low, words like blades slicing the air. The farmer couldn't understand, but he could feel the tension, the weight of years of pride and pain. Finally, the rider pointed toward her and then toward the cabin. The meaning was clear. "He says I belong to them," she said quietly. "He says this land belongs to their dead, not the living." The farmer took a step closer, his voice steady but hard. "Then they'll have to take it from us." She turned to him, her eyes full of something between sorrow and courage. "If you fight, they will answer with fire." He met her gaze. "Then let it burn." The rider turned his horse and rode back to the others. A signal call echoed, a long, rising cry that made the ground tremble. The woman closed her eyes briefly. "It has begun," she whispered. The first flames appeared along the ridge, small but spreading fast, licking at the dry brush. The wind carried the heat toward them. The farmer grabbed buckets, throwing water along the walls while she moved with quiet precision, covering the windows with wet blankets, her movements sure even as sparks fell from the sky. The fire roared louder, a wall of red against the night. From the dark came the sound of horses again, closer now, circling. Shadows flickered through the smoke. The woman stood by the door, holding a small wooden charm in her hands, her lips moving in silent prayer. The farmer's heart pounded as he raised his rifle, watching the figures shift in the darkness. The air was alive with heat, smoke and sound, the rush of flames, the hiss of wind, the low calls of men hidden beyond sight. He could barely breathe. Beside him, she whispered something in her language, a word that sounded like both sorrow and strength. Then, through the smoke, he saw them. 3 riders breaking from the dark, charging toward the cabin. He fired once, the sound splitting the night. One horse reared, the others veered off, but more were coming. The woman grabbed his arm. "They will not stop," she said. "They come for both of us now." He turned toward her, the firelight painting her face gold in shadow. "Then we stand together," he said. Outside, the storm of fire and fury gathered. The riders drew closer. The flames swallowed the sky. And in that moment, as the desert howled around them, both knew the next breath would carry them into whatever fate the land had been holding for them all along. The flames rolled through the valley like a living beast, devouring brush and dry grass as the air filled with choking heat. The farmer and the Apache woman stood at the edge of the porch, their faces lit by the pulsing glow. The horses circled in the distance, their riders half hidden behind veils of smoke. The desert wind carried the sound of war cries and crackling fire together until it was impossible to tell which was which. The farmer's hands were steady, though his heart beat fast beneath his shirt. The rifle was hot against his palms. The woman stood beside him, calm in the chaos, her eyes glinting with something fierce and mournful all at once. A single rider broke from the group, galloping hard through the smoke. He came close enough that the firelight showed his painted face. The woman stepped forward before the farmer could lift the rifle. She raised her hands and called out in her own language, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the roar of the wind. The rider slowed. He shouted something back, angry, pleading, full of bitterness. The farmer couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the tension between them, like a stretched rope ready to snap. "They think I'm still theirs," she said, her voice steady though her chest rose fast with breath. "They think this is about pride. They do not understand what I have become." The rider's horse reared. His arm lifted, and for one long moment the farmer thought the fight would begin. But then, from somewhere deeper in the hills, a horn sounded, a long, low call that silenced the world. The rider turned his horse and vanished into the smoke. The rest followed, disappearing like shadows before dawn. The flames burned all night. Together they worked to save what they could, beating the fire back with soaked cloths and buckets of muddy water from the creek. The cabin held, though blackened and scarred. By morning, the hills were silent again. Smoke hung over the valley like fog. Ash drifted down, soft as snow. They stood together in the gray dawn, looking at what was left. The crops were gone. The fence was half burned. The barn had collapsed. The land looked dead, yet there was a strange peace in it, an emptiness that felt clean, as if something dark had finally burned itself out. The farmer leaned on his shovel, too tired to speak. The woman stepped forward, scooped a handful of blackened soil and let it run through her fingers. "Fire takes," she said quietly, "but it also leaves space for new life." For the first time, he saw her smile, a small, weary thing, but real. She turned toward the sunrise, the light catching her face. "They will not come again," she said. They saw the flames. "They think their anger has done its work." He nodded, though his heart was heavy. "And what will you do now?" he asked. She looked at the land, then at him. "This place still breathes," she said. "It is hurt, but not broken. Like us." Over the next few days, they began to rebuild. The townsfolk came riding through once they saw the smoke had cleared. They found the farm standing and the pair still alive, and none of them said a word for a long time. The deputy dismounted, walked through the blackened yard, and took off his hat. "We thought you were gone," he said quietly. The farmer just nodded. "So did we." He didn't tell them what had really happened. Neither did she. When the deputy asked about the fire, the farmer said only, "The wind brought it." It was the kind of answer the desert liked, true, but not complete. The neighbors helped rebuild the barn and bring seed. Nobody spoke again about taking her away. The fear that once filled their eyes was gone now, replaced with something more like respect, or maybe just understanding. They saw the land still standing and the two who refused to leave it. As the weeks passed, the hills began to green again. Shoots of grass pushed through the black earth. The creek ran stronger after the rains, and wildflowers appeared where the fire had swept through. The woman planted new corn beside the ashes of the old. The farmer worked beside her, saying little but feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet hope. At night they sat by the fire, listening to the soft hum of crickets. Sometimes she spoke of her people, not with anger, but with a kind of distant love, as though the pain had turned into memory. "They live by the law of the land," she said one night, "and the land forgives nothing, but it teaches everything." He looked at her and said, "You belong here now." She smiled faintly. "No one belongs to land," she said. "We only borrow it for a while." The summer turned to fall. The new crops grew strong, the air cooled, and the valley took on the gold of late harvest. The wounds of fire faded into the earth. Yet the story of the farmer and the Apache woman spread quietly beyond the valley. Some said it was a story of defiance, others of grace. To the farmer, it was neither. It was simply life, hard, unpredictable, and worth living, even when it burned. One evening near the end of harvest, the woman stood by the creek, watching the reflection of the sky in the water. He walked up beside her, silent for a long moment before saying, "You could still go north if you wanted. Start new." She shook her head slowly. "This is new enough," she said. "I used to think being given away was a punishment. But now I see, it was a path." He nodded, looking out at the horizon, where the hills glowed with the last light of day. "Then we'll walk it together," he said. She didn't answer, but her hand brushed against his, a quiet gesture of understanding. The sun dipped lower, painting the land in golden fire, but this time the light was gentle, not cruel. The valley breathed again. As the seasons passed, the scars faded into the land, and what once had been a place of loss became a home. Travelers passing through would sometimes stop for water and ask about the woman who lived with the quiet farmer. Some said she was a healer, others said she spoke to the earth. The farmer never corrected them. He would just smile and point to the fields and say, "Ask the land. It knows." Years later, the valley would remember the great fire, the one that nearly took everything. They would remember the two who stood against it, not with hate or vengeance, but with stubborn hope. The story would be told around fires in the winters that followed. The Apache woman who was given away as punishment, and the poor farmer who found life again through her courage. And though time would blur their names, the land would not forget. The wind still carried the echo of her songs through the canyons. The earth she once touched still grew strong beneath the sun. In the end, their home stood as quiet proof that even in the harshest places, among dust, loss, and fire, something good can grow. The valley that once burned now bloomed again, and the house that began in silence now held the heartbeat of two souls who had learned that peace isn't given by tribes or towns or the turning of fate. It's built slowly, by those who choose to stay when everything else tries to drive them away. And when the evening winds came whispering through the fields, the farmer would sometimes pause from his work, lift his head and smile faintly at the sound. To him it was not the ghosts of the past, It was her voice, still calling through the hills, reminding the land and him that love, like the desert itself, can outlast even the fiercest fire.